Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. The envelope sat unopened on the kitchen table, its edges frayed from years of waiting. It had been 2 years since Ethan Morgan, DA agent and family protector, had died. But the weight of his absence still hung heavy in the Morgan household. When Clara finally tore it open, she didn't know she was unleashing a storm. Hidden inside were secrets, ones that could bring down a cartel and expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power. As Hunter, the family's fiercely loyal war dog, growled at the unfamiliar black SUVs rolling through Cedarvale, it became clear Ethan's enemies were coming for them, and his plan was about to be set into motion. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. The soft glow of dawn crept over Cedarvale, illuminating the quiet suburban streets with hues of gold and pale blue. It was a peaceful town, the kind where neighbors knew each other by name and little changed from one year to the next. But to Hunter, the retired war dog, this serenity meant nothing. Peace could shatter in an instant. He moved methodically, his large frame cutting through the cool morning air with precision. His ears twitched at faint rustles in the distance, and his nose quivered, scanning for anything out of place. The backyard, bordered by a worn wooden fence and thick hedges, was his domain. It was his job to know every sound, every scent, every shadow. At the edge of the patio, Lila Morgan leaned against the doorframe, her arms wrapped around her chest to ward off the chill. She watched Hunter as he made his patrol, circling the perimeter like clockwork. There was something mesmerizing about him, the way his movements were calculated, his body low and his gaze sweeping across the yard like a soldier scanning a battlefield. He wasn't just a dog to her. He was a protector, a guardian, a legacy. Her grandmother, Clara, called him a living shadow, and the nickname fit. His sleek coat, the color of midnight, seemed to absorb the dim light around him. To Lila, he was just Hunter. But to others, he had been Phantom, a war hero, her father's partner. She couldn't remember a time when Hunter wasn't in her life, though she'd only truly come to understand his importance after her father, Ethan, had passed. "Anything out there, boy?" Lila called softly, though she already knew the answer. Hunter never missed a thing. He paused, lifting his head, ears swiveling toward the far corner of the yard. His gaze locked on something beyond the fence. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then his lips pulled back, and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. It wasn't loud, but it sent a chill through Lila nonetheless. She stepped out onto the patio, her sneakers scraping against the concrete. "What is it?" Hunter didn't answer. Of course. But his body tensed. His tail, which had been still, now held stiff behind him. He took a step forward, his paws silent on the grass, his eyes fixed like twin lasers on something Lila couldn't see. She followed his gaze, squinting toward the far end of the street where the fence ended and the road began. That was when she saw it. A black SUV, parked too far down to be an immediate concern, but just close enough to make her uneasy. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled faintly, sending small puffs of exhaust into the cold morning air. "Hey, Hunter," she whispered, taking a step back. "Come on. Let's go inside." The dog didn't move. He remained rooted in place, his growl deepening. A low rumble that felt almost like a warning. Lila's heart began to race. Hunter wasn't like other dogs. He didn't bark at squirrels or chase cars. If he was reacting, there was a reason. And that reason usually wasn't good. "Hunter," she called. Her voice sharper now. That got his attention. He glanced back at her briefly, his sharp amber eyes meeting hers, before turning back toward the fence. He didn't growl again, but his posture remained rigid. She stepped inside, leaving the door open just enough for him to follow. She watched as he took one last look at the street, then trotted back across the yard and into the house. The moment he crossed the threshold, his demeanor shifted. He nudged her hip with his nose, his way of saying, "All clear for now." But the tension in his muscles didn't entirely leave. He moved toward the window near the back door, sitting on his haunches with his head tilted slightly as if listening for something beyond her range. "Hunter acting strange again," came Clara's voice from the kitchen. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of bacon frying on the stove. The older woman leaned against the counter, her sharp gray eyes flicking toward the window where Hunter now Saturday. "He's been on edge the past few days." Lila nodded, closing the door behind her. "There's an SUV parked down the street. It's been sitting there for a while." That caught Clara's attention. She turned the burner off, setting the pan aside before wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What kind of SUV?" "Black. Tinted windows." Lila hesitated. "I don't think it's anyone around here." Clara's jaw tightened slightly. She glanced at Hunter, who hadn't moved from his spot by the window. He growled at it. "Yeah." The older woman's expression shifted, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Your father always said to trust that dog's instincts. If Hunter doesn't like something, there's a reason." Lila bit her lip, her mind flickering briefly to her father. She could almost hear his voice, "Trust Phantom. Lila. He sees what we can't. Here's what we don't." She swallowed the lump in her throat, turning back toward Hunter, who was still watching the window like a hawk. Outside, the SUV's engine cut off. The faint rumble disappeared, leaving the street eerily quiet. Hunter's ears twitched, and he stood, his body tense once again. He stared through the glass, his nose almost pressed against it. "What is it?" Clara asked, stepping up beside him. Hunter let out a sharp exhale, his breath fogging the glass. But he didn't growl this time. Instead, he remained utterly still, as if waiting. Clara frowned, muttering under her breath, "Too early in the day for this nonsense." She grabbed the cordless phone from the counter and dialed a number, her movements brisk. "Just in case," she murmured, though whether she was talking to herself or Lila, it wasn't clear. Hunter didn't move. Whatever was out there, it had his full attention. The kitchen filled with a soft clink as Clara set down her coffee cup, her sharp eyes flicking toward the window every so often. The morning news hummed faintly in the background, its muted voices a reminder of the quiet chaos of the world outside their small town. But Clara had learned over the years that chaos wasn't confined to the big cities. It crept into places like Cedarvale. "Two black SUVs," she muttered, her tone half contemplative, half wary. "I don't like it." Lila, now perched on one of the kitchen stools, picked at the edge of her toast. "You think it's something bad?" Her grandmother gave a faint, humorless smile. "Bad doesn't usually announce itself, Lila. But it doesn't exactly hide in plain sight, either." Her gaze shifted toward Hunter, who had settled by the window, his posture still alert. "And when that dog starts acting strange, It's a good reason to start paying attention. There it was again, that unshakable confidence Clara had in Hunter. Lila couldn't blame her. The stories her dad used to tell about Hunter, or Phantom, as he had called him, were the stuff of legends. A Belgian Malinois that had served in 3 combat tours, taking down enemies with precision and saving countless lives in the process. Her dad had always said that Hunter was more than a dog. He was a soldier, a partner, and a protector. Do you think maybe it's connected to Dad? Lila asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara froze for a moment, her expression tightening. I don't know, she admitted, her voice careful. But your father made sure we'd be ready for anything. If it is connected to him, we'll handle it. The weight of her words lingered in the air. Lila glanced toward Hunter, who hadn't budged from his position. It was comforting, in a way, to see him there. Even in his silence, he radiated a sense of control, as though he were already mapping out a plan for whatever threat might come their way. The sudden ring of the doorbell shattered the quiet, making Lila jump. Hunter was on his feet in an instant, his body snapping into focus. He moved toward the door with purpose, his head low and his ears pricked forward. Stay back, Clara instructed firmly, already moving toward the door. She picked up the mail opener from the counter, a small, seemingly insignificant object, but one she gripped like a weapon. Grandma, it's probably just the mailman, Lila said, though even she didn't believe it. Clara didn't reply. She peered through the peephole, her body stiffening as she saw the figure outside. A man in a brown uniform stood there, holding a package. His truck was parked in the driveway, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Hunter let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on the door. After a tense moment, Clara opened the door just enough to speak. Can I help you? The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Morning, ma'am. Got a delivery for a L. Morgan? Who's it from? Clara asked, her tone sharp. The man hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Clara's grip on the door tightened. Hunter stepped forward, his growl growing louder. It's, from Arizona Logistics, the man said quickly, holding the package out. Just need a signature. Clara didn't move. Her instincts screamed at her to close the door, but she didn't want to show fear. Instead, she extended her hand for the package, keeping her eyes locked on the man's face. As soon as she took it, she nodded curtly. Thank you. Have a good day. She closed the door before he could say another word, bolting it and turning to face Hunter. The dog hadn't relaxed, his attention still fixed on the door. What's wrong? Lila asked nervously. Wasn't it just a delivery? Clara set the package on the counter, staring at it for a long moment. Maybe. But that man wasn't local. I've never seen him before. So? It could have been a temp. Maybe. Clara repeated, but her tone said otherwise. She reached for the envelope opener again, slicing through the tape on the box. Inside was nothing but a small bundle of papers, all blank. What the? Clara muttered, pulling the papers out. Beneath them, something caught her eye, a faint red light blinking at the bottom of the box. Her heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, she grabbed the box and hurled it into the sink. Hunter. Move, she barked, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her back just as the box emitted a sharp beep and burst into a shower of sparks. What was that? Lila cried, her voice trembling. Clara didn't answer immediately. her chest heaving as she stared at the smoldering remains in the sink. "A warning," she said finally, her voice low. "Whoever's out there isn't just watching us. They're testing us." Hunter barked sharply, drawing their attention back to the window. Outside, the black SUV was gone. Clara's mind raced. She had known something was wrong the moment Hunter started acting strange. But this was confirmation. Whoever these people were, they weren't amateurs. And they weren't going to stop. "Grandma," Lila said quietly, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" Clara placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, her grip firm. "We stay calm. We stay smart. And we trust Hunter. Your dad trained him for a reason." The older woman turned toward the hallway, her mind already working through the steps she needed to take. First, she'd call Detective Harper. If anyone could help them figure this out, it was him. Second, she'd go through the files Ethan had left behind, the ones she hadn't touched since his death. And third, well, she'd have to trust Hunter to guide them through whatever was coming. As she picked up the phone, Hunter returned to his spot by the window, his gaze scanning the street with the precision of a soldier on duty. Whatever threat was looming, Hunter was ready. The day passed in fits and starts, each hour weighed down by the memory of the morning's strange delivery. Clara kept her movements sharp and deliberate, her eyes darting toward the windows more often than usual. Hunter followed her lead, pacing the house with silent vigilance. He was a shadow, always near but never in the way, his every step purposeful. For Lila, it was harder to shake the unease. She sat at the dining table, her homework spread out before her, though her pencil barely touched the page. She couldn't stop thinking about the SUV, the man at the door, the sparks in the sink. Each image replayed in her mind, knotting her stomach tighter with every loop. Dad would know what to do, she muttered under her breath, barely aware she'd spoken aloud. Clara, busy flipping through a small black notebook, one of Ethan's, paused and looked up. "He does," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. "That's why he left us this." She tapped the notebook with her finger, her expression hard but calm. "Your dad didn't trust Easy, but he trusted Hunter and the plans he made. We stick to them." Lila hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the dog lying near the back door. His ears perked at the sound of his name, but he didn't move. She remembered the way her dad had spoken about Hunter, always with a mix of pride and awe. "Phantom isn't just a dog, Lila," he'd said once, crouching beside her as Hunter practiced a command. "He's trained for more than you can imagine. He'll protect you when I can't." Those words had stayed with her, even if she hadn't fully understood them at the time. Now, they felt heavier, as though her dad had known this day would come. "Does the notebook say anything about this?" Lila asked, gesturing vaguely at the room around her, the lingering tension that seemed to cling to the air. Clara shook her head. "Not exactly. But your dad wasn't one to leave things to chance." She flipped to a marked page, her eyes scanning the neat, deliberate handwriting. "He wrote here about contingencies, safe houses, escape routes, people we can trust. If something happens, we follow his lead." The mention of safe houses made Lila sit up straighter. "Like actual places?" "Exactly." Clara's tone left no room for doubt. "He set them up years ago, just in case. And now, it seems just in case is here." The thought made Lila's chest tighten. She couldn't decide if it was comforting or terrifying that her dad had prepared for something like this. On the one hand, it meant they had a plan. On the other, it meant he'd seen danger coming long before they had. as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room floor. The tension in the house didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper, more focused. Hunter remained stationed by the window, his gaze sweeping the street outside like a silent sentry. When the phone rang, Clara was on it in an instant. "Detective Harper," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "It's me." On the other end, Luke Harper didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's going on, Clara?" She recounted the events of the day, the SUV, the suspicious delivery, the flashing light in the box. "It's not just paranoia, Luke," she finished. "Something's happening, and I need to know if it's connected to Ethan." There was a long pause before Luke replied, his voice low and serious. "You're not wrong to worry. We've been tracking increased cartel activity in your area for weeks now. Quiet stuff, unmarked vehicles, men asking questions they shouldn't be. But nothing we can nail down." "And you think they're targeting us?" Clara pressed. "It's possible," he admitted. "Your son made enemies, Clara. Powerful ones. If they think you have something of his information, they won't hesitate to come after it." Clara glanced toward Lila, who was now pretending to focus on her homework. "What do you recommend?" "I'll come by tomorrow morning," Luke said. "Until then, keep the house locked up tight. And don't ignore Hunter. If he senses something, trust him." "I always do," Clara replied before hanging up. She set the phone down and exhaled, the weight of the situation settling over her shoulders. The next morning, Lila arrived at school with a nervous energy she couldn't shake. The hallways felt too loud, the faces around her too unfamiliar. She tried to focus on the routine: math class, science lab, lunch, but her mind kept drifting back to the black SUV and Hunter's growl. During her free period, she sat by the window in the library, staring out at the parking lot. That was when she saw them. Two men in dark jackets stood by a nondescript sedan, their postures casual but alert. They weren't talking to anyone, and they didn't seem interested in the school itself. Instead, their eyes scanned the area, lingering on the students as they passed. Lila's stomach flipped. She recognized one of them, the man who had delivered the package the day before. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, gripping the edge of her desk. But it was easier said than done. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from those men as possible. But where could she go? And what if running only made things worse? Her fingers brushed the small keychain dangling from her backpack. A gift from her dad. It was shaped like a tiny flashlight, though she knew it was more than that. Her dad had called it a signal beacon. She didn't know how it worked, but she remembered him saying, "If you're ever in trouble, press this. Hunter will know." The memory steadied her, if only a little. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. If those men were here for her, she couldn't panic. She had to be smart. She had to trust her dad's training and Hunter's instincts. Back at the house, Clara paced the living room, the notebook open on the coffee table. She'd spent the morning reviewing its contents, looking for anything that might give them an edge. Each page was filled with precise instructions, from emergency codes to prearranged meeting points. It was almost overwhelming, but she knew she had to be ready. For Lila. For Ethan. Hunter sat nearby, his ears twitching at every creak and groan of the house. He hadn't relaxed since the previous day, his body tense and alert. Clara reached down to scratch behind his ears, murmuring, "You feel it too, don't you?" He gave a soft whine in response, his head turning toward the front door. Clara followed his gaze, her stomach twisting. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't face it unprepared. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows over Cedar Vale as the unease surrounding Lila, Clara, and Hunter grew. Inside the Morgan home, the air was tense. Hunter patrolled from window to window, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of movement. He was restless, and so were the people he protected. At the kitchen table, Clara shuffled through more of Ethan's notes, searching for any detail she might have overlooked. His careful handwriting detailed procedures, contacts, and locations, but no matter how many times she reread it, the sense of foreboding wouldn't leave her. "Anything new?" Lila asked, her voice hesitant as she entered the room. She clutched her backpack tightly. Having just returned from school, her face was pale, and her eyes darted toward the windows, mirroring Hunter's nervous energy. Clara shook her head. "Nothing we didn't already know. But your dad didn't write these notes just for fun. He knew something like this might happen." Lila hesitated, then set her backpack on the table. There were 2 men at school today. One of them was the guy who delivered that package yesterday. That caught Clara's full attention. She straightened, her eyes narrowing. What did they do? They didn't come inside. Just stood by a car in the parking lot, watching people. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she unzipped her backpack, pulling out the small flashlight keychain her dad had given her years ago. "I almost pressed this." Clara stared at the keychain, her expression softening for a moment. "He gave you that for a reason," she said quietly. "If you ever feel like you're in danger, don't hesitate to use it. Hunter will respond." Hunter, as if hearing his name, padded over to Lila's side, nudging her hand with his nose. The gesture was gentle, reassuring, and it brought a faint smile to her face despite the fear lingering in her chest. "Did you tell anyone about the men?" Clara asked. Lila shook her head. "I didn't want to make a scene. And I thought it might make things worse." "You did the right thing," Clara said, though her tone was grim. "But this isn't something we can ignore anymore. If they're watching you at school, they're getting bolder." The black SUVs returned that evening, creeping down the street like predators stalking prey. Hunter was the first to notice, his ears perking up and his body stiffening. He moved to the front window, his nose pressed against the glass as he let out a low, guttural growl. "What is it?" Lila asked, moving to stand beside him. She followed his gaze and spotted the vehicles. Her stomach dropped. "They're back." Clara joined them, her face hardening as she saw the cars. "Stay away from the windows," she ordered, pulling the curtains closed. She grabbed the phone and dialed Detective Harper's number. "Luke." "It's Clara," she said as soon as he picked up. "They're here again. 2 black SUVs. Right outside the house." There was a pause on the other end before Luke replied, his voice tense. "I'll send a patrol car to circle the area. In the meantime, don't engage. Stay inside. Lock all the doors. And keep Hunter close. We're not going anywhere," Clara said firmly before hanging up. She turned to Lila. "Go upstairs and pack a bag. Just in case." "Pack a bag? For what?" Lila asked, her voice rising in panic. "For wherever we might need to go," Clara replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Do it now, Lila. We don't have time to waste." The house felt unnaturally quiet as Lila climbed the stairs. Her mind racing. What would she pack? What would she need if they had to leave? She grabbed her school bag and stuffed it with essentials, her phone charger, a change of clothes, a small photo of her dad. The flashlight keychain went into the side pocket, her fingers lingering on it for a moment. Hunter's bark echoed from downstairs, loud and sharp. She froze, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. Lila, stay upstairs, Clara yelled from below. Ignoring the warning, Lila crept to the top of the stairs and peeked down. The front door was still locked, but the sound of footsteps outside sent chills down her spine. The shadows of figures moved across the curtains, their presence unmistakable. Hunter stood near the door, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the sound. His growl deepened, a primal warning that sent shivers through the air. Back door, Clara hissed, rushing to lock it. She grabbed the baseball bat that leaned against the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly. The sound of metal rattling filled the air as someone jiggled the doorknob. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide their presence anymore. Lila clutched the banister, her breath caught in her throat. Grandma, stay put, Clara barked, her eyes never leaving the back door. Hunter, hold! The dog didn't move, his focus razor sharp. His muscles were coiled like a spring, ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. A loud knock came from the front door, followed by a voice. Clara Morgan. Open the door. We just want to talk. The tone was calm, almost polite. But Clara wasn't fooled. She tightened her grip on the bat and moved to the front window. Peeking through the edge of the curtain, there were two men standing on the porch, both dressed in dark jackets. One of them held a clipboard, as if trying to pass as a delivery driver. But the faint bulge under his jacket told Clara he was carrying a weapon. You're not fooling anyone, she muttered under her breath. She glanced at Hunter, who remained perfectly still, waiting for her signal. The man knocked again, harder this time. Mrs. Morgan, we know you're in there. We just have a few questions. Clara stepped away from the window and motioned for Hunter to follow her. She grabbed her phone and dialed Luke's number again. They're at my door, she said quietly. Two men, armed. Stay inside. Luke replied immediately. I'm on my way. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Hunter never left Clara's side, his body a shield between her and the door. Lila remained frozen at the top of the stairs, clutching her bag like a lifeline. Finally, the distant sound of sirens cut through the night. The men on the porch stiffened, their heads turning toward the approaching lights. One of them muttered something to the other before they retreated, jogging back to their SUV and climbing inside. Hunter barked once, a triumphant sound that seemed to echo Clara's relief. She exhaled slowly, her grip on the bat loosening as the tension in the room began to fade. The patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing as Detective Harper stepped out. He approached the house cautiously, scanning the area before knocking on the door. It's me, he called, his voice steady. Clara unlocked the door, letting him in. They're gone, she said immediately. Took off as soon as they heard the sirens. Luke nodded, his expression grim. They'll be back. Whoever they are. They're not giving up easily. Clara glanced at Hunter, who was now sitting calmly by her side, his focus still sharp despite the apparent calm. Good, she said. Because neither are we. The attic was a place Clara rarely visited. Dust covered the boxes and forgotten keepsakes stacked haphazardly along the wooden beams. But this morning, She climbed the creaky stairs with purpose. A flashlight in hand and her mind racing. She had remembered something Ethan had said years ago. A throwaway comment that now felt like a clue. If you ever need answers, Mom, check the old chest in the attic, he'd told her with a wink. At the time, she thought he was joking. But now, with everything happening, she couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility. The chest was tucked into a far corner. An unassuming wooden box with brass hinges. It had once belonged to her father, but Ethan had claimed it for his own as a young man. She knelt beside it and ran her fingers along the lid, feeling the grooves of the worn wood. With a deep breath, she unlatched it and lifted the top. Inside was a collection of items, faded photographs, a pocket knife, an old compass. But beneath them, she found a sealed envelope with her name scrawled across the front in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Her throat tightened as she picked it up, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. She opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper folded neatly in thirds. The words written on it were direct and methodical, just like Ethan himself. Mom, if you're reading this, something has gone very wrong. This is what you need to know. Hunter is more than a family dog. You already know about his training, but you don't know everything. He has a set of protocols, emergency commands I programmed into him during our time together. They're designed for situations just like this. If the threat becomes immediate, use the phrase Delta 7 override. It will trigger his combat instincts and ensure he prioritizes Lila's safety above all else. Trust him. Trust his training. And trust yourself. You've always been stronger than you think. The note ended there. But Clara didn't need more. She folded the paper back into the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Ethan had always been meticulous, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But reading his words now, knowing he'd anticipated this exact kind of danger, made her chest tighten with both pride and sorrow. Delta 7 override, she murmured, committing the phrase to memory. She tucked the envelope into her pocket and climbed back down the attic stairs, her mind racing. Whatever was coming, she'd be ready. Across town, in a dimly lit warehouse, Victor Kane leaned against a table, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His team of enforcers stood in a loose circle, awaiting his instructions. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that came before action. Here's the plan, Victor began, his voice calm but firm. We split into 2 teams. One group handles the grandmother. The other intercepts the girl at school. One of the men, Miguel, raised an eyebrow. The dog? Victor waved a hand dismissively. It's just a dog. Highly trained. Sure. But at the end of the day, it's an animal. Focus on the targets that matter. The grandmother will have what we need. The girls just leverage. The men nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They weren't amateurs. Each of them had military experience, handpicked by Victor for their precision and efficiency. This wasn't their first job, and it wouldn't be their last. Timing is everything, Victor continued. The school team moves first. Keep it quiet. We don't need a scene. The house team waits for my signal. Once we have both, the rest will fall into place. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. Remember, no mistakes. No loose ends. The men dispersed, each heading to their assigned task. Victor lingered a moment longer, staring at the map spread across the table. He traced a finger along the route to the Morgan house, his mind already calculating every possible variable. Just a dog, he muttered to himself. But even as he said it, He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was underestimating something. Or someone. Back at the Morgan house, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her fingers drumming against the wood as she thought about Ethan's letter. She glanced at Hunter, who was lying near the back door, his ears twitching at every faint noise. He seemed calm, but she knew better. He was always listening, always watching. "Hunter," she said softly. The dog lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers. "Delta 7 override." The words felt strange on her tongue, but the effect was immediate. Hunter stood, his posture shifting subtly. He was still the same dog, but there was a new edge to his movements, a precision that hadn't been there a moment ago. He moved to her side, his head tilted slightly as if awaiting further instructions. Clara reached down to scratch behind his ears, a small gesture of reassurance. "Good boy," she murmured. "We're going to need you." The sound of an engine outside made her freeze. She moved to the window, peeking through the edge of the curtain. A black SUV was parked across the street, its engine idling. Her pulse quickened. "Lila," she called, her voice steady but urgent. "Get your things. Now. Upstairs." Lila grabbed her packed bag and hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" "Time's up," Clara replied. She turned to Hunter. "Stay close to her." The dog moved to Lila's side, his presence a comforting weight against her leg. Clara grabbed her phone and dialed Detective Harper's number. "They're here," she said as soon as he answered. "At least one car. Maybe more. I'm activating Hunter's protocols." "Understood," Luke replied. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. And let him do his job. I'm on my way." Clara hung up and turned to Lila. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever happens, you stick with Hunter. Do exactly what he says. He's a dog." "Grandma," Lila said, her voice trembling. "He's more than a dog." Clara shot back. "He's your dad's plan." The weight of those words silenced any argument Lila might have made. She nodded, her fingers curling into Hunter's fur as the first sound of footsteps echoed outside the house. The sound of heavy boots on gravel sent a jolt through Clara. She moved swiftly to the front door, locking the deadbolt and sliding the security chain into place. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. Years of military nursing had taught her to focus under pressure. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Lila," she called over her shoulder, her voice calm but commanding. "Stay behind me." The first knock came, loud and deliberate. Clara flinched but didn't move from her spot by the door. Hunter stood beside her, his posture rigid, ears pinned forward, and eyes locked on the source of the sound. He was coiled like a spring, ready to act at the first sign of a threat. "Mrs. Morgan," a voice called from the other side. It was deep, calm, and unsettlingly polite. "We know you're in there. Open the door, and we can talk." Clara didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at Hunter, who hadn't taken his eyes off the door. His growl was low and steady, a warning that no one outside could miss. The voice came again, sharper this time. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just want to talk." The footsteps outside multiplied, moving around the perimeter of the house. Clara stepped back, her grip tightening on the baseball bat she'd grabbed earlier. "They're trying to surround us," she muttered under her breath. She glanced at Lila, who stood frozen near the stairs, her bag clutched to her chest. "Lila," Clara said firmly, drawing the girl's attention. "Go upstairs. Lock yourself in the bathroom. Don't come out until I tell you. But Grandma. Now. Clara's tone brooked no argument. With one last, terrified glance, Lila obeyed, darting up the stairs. Hunter stayed rooted to his spot, his growl deepening as the sound of shuffling feet reached the back door. The next knock was harder. Almost a bang. The calm facade was gone now, replaced by impatience. Mrs. Morgan. Last chance. Open the door, or we're coming in. When the response was silence, the intruders didn't hesitate. The doorframe shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. Hunter barked sharply, his body tensing further. Clara stepped back, her eyes darting between the front and back doors. The sound of metal scraping against the lock told her they weren't bluffing. The front door wouldn't hold much longer. Clara knew she had to act fast. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Ethan's note, her eyes scanning the line she needed. Delta 7 override, she said, her voice steady. The effect was immediate. Hunter moved with purpose, his growl ceasing as his focus sharpened. He stepped closer to the door, his head low, his movements deliberate. He was waiting for his moment. The door gave way with a loud crack, swinging open to reveal two men in dark jackets. They froze for a split second at the sight of Hunter. But that hesitation was all he needed. With a speed that defied his size, Hunter lunged. His powerful jaws clamped onto the first man's arm, dragging him down with brutal efficiency. The man shouted in pain, his weapon clattering to the floor as Hunter twisted, forcing him onto his back. The second intruder reacted quickly, raising his weapon. But Clara was faster. She swung the bat with all her strength, catching him across the side. He staggered, dropping his gun, and Hunter was on him in an instant. The dog's teeth bared as he forced the man to the ground, keeping him immobilized. The first man tried to scramble to his feet, clutching his injured arm. But Clara leveled the bat at him, her voice cold. Don't move. Heavy footsteps from the back of the house signaled more intruders. Hunter released the second man, snapping his head toward the sound. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the back door, his body low to the ground as he disappeared around the corner. Clara didn't have time to think. She grabbed one of the intruder's guns, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. She moved toward the back of the house, her ears straining to catch every sound. A sharp bark echoed from the kitchen, followed by a thud. Clara rounded the corner to find another man on the ground, his legs tangled with a broken chair. Hunter stood over him, his teeth bared, a low growl rumbling from his chest. The man didn't dare move. The back door swung open, and another intruder stepped inside, his weapon raised. Clara fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The man froze, his eyes widening as he registered the sight of the gun in her hands. Get out, she ordered, her voice steady and unwavering. The man hesitated, his gaze darting between Clara and Hunter. The dog took a step forward, his growl deepening. That was all it took. The man turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. The house fell silent, save for the sound of Clara's heavy breathing. She lowered the gun, her eyes scanning the room. Hunter stood in the center, his gaze sharp and alert, his body still coiled with tension. He waited, listening, until he was certain the threat had passed. Good boy, Clara said softly, her voice breaking the silence. She moved toward him, placing a hand on his head. He leaned into her touch for a brief moment before pulling away, his attention shifting back to the door. Upstairs, Lila emerged cautiously from the bathroom, her wide eyes darting around the hallway. "Is it over?" "For now," Clara called back. "Come down. But stay close to Hunter." Lila descended the stairs, her movements hesitant. When she reached the bottom, she froze at the sight of the two men still on the floor, their expressions twisted in pain. One of them tried to sit up, but Clara shot him a warning glare. "Don't even think about it," she snapped, keeping the gun trained on him. Hunter moved to Lila's side, his body pressing against her leg in a gesture of comfort. She placed a trembling hand on his head, her fingers curling into his fur. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wait for Detective Harper," Clara replied. "And we stick to the plan." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The hum of activity at St. Mary's Middle School felt strangely hollow to Lila. She sat by the window in her math class, her gaze drifting toward the parking lot. The familiar routine of schoolwork was distant now, overshadowed by the memory of the two men she had seen the day before. Every sound, every voice, every shuffle of papers felt muted compared to the pounding in her ears. "Lila, are you paying attention?" The teacher's voice broke through her thoughts. "Yes, ma'am," she replied quickly, straightening in her chair. But her mind wasn't on equations or word problems. It was on the two dark figures who had loitered just outside the school grounds, their eyes scanning the crowd with unsettling focus. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Students gathered their things, shuffling toward the door in a rush for lunch. Lila lingered, her movements slow, hesitant. She was reluctant to leave the relative safety of the classroom. She finally stepped into the hallway, clutching her bag tightly, and started toward the cafeteria. The chatter of students filled the space, a sea of noise that felt oddly distant. Her stomach churned, the feeling of being watched returning with full force. "Hey there, kid," a familiar voice cut through the din. She turned to see Martha Evans, her neighbor and family friend, standing just a few feet away. The older woman was dressed casually, her ever-present smile masking the sharp intelligence in her eyes. "Aunt Martha?" Lila said, confused. "What are you doing here?" "Felt like checking in on my favorite girl," Martha replied lightly. Her tone was easy, but the look she gave Lila was anything but casual. "Thought we could grab lunch together." Lila frowned. "At school? Why?" Asterisk before she could press further. Martha leaned in, lowering her voice. "We don't have much time. Those men from yesterday, they're here. Detective Harper called me. He said they might make a move." Lila's heart raced. "What do we do?" "We get you out of here," Martha said firmly. "But you need to stay calm and follow my lead." Minutes later, they were walking briskly toward the library, their pace unhurried to avoid drawing attention. Martha kept a firm grip on Lila's shoulder, steering her through the crowded hallways with practiced ease. "We'll use the side exit near the library," Martha murmured. "It's less obvious." Lila nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She glanced over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of one of the men near the main entrance. He wasn't looking at her, but his presence was enough to send a wave of panic through her. As they neared the library, Martha pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Detective Harper's got officers nearby," she said. "They'll create a distraction to buy us time." The library was nearly empty, its quiet aisles a stark contrast to the chaos building outside. Martha led Lila to a small door at the back, marked "Staff Only." She pulled out a key and unlocked it, motioning for Lila to step through. "This leads to the parking lot." Martha explained. We'll take my car and get you somewhere safe. Lila hesitated, glancing back toward the hallway. What if they follow us? They won't, Martha said, her tone resolute. Not if we move quickly. Now. Go. The door creaked softly as they stepped outside. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars. Martha's silver sedan was parked near the edge, its engine already running. Get in, she instructed, opening the passenger door for Lila. As the girl climbed in, Martha scanned the area, her eyes narrowing. Stay low. The sound of hurried footsteps reached them just as Martha slid into the driver's seat. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw one of the men emerging from the school, his head turning as he scanned the lot. Hold on, Martha muttered, shifting the car into gear. The tires screeched as she pulled out of the parking space, the sudden motion catching the man's attention. He shouted something, raising a hand to signal his partner. But Martha didn't slow down. The sedan sped onto the main road, weaving through traffic with precision. Lila clutched her seatbelt, her heart hammering in her chest. They saw us. I know, Martha replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. But they won't catch us. In the distance, a black SUV pulled onto the road, its sleek frame cutting through traffic as it pursued them. Martha glanced in the rearview mirror, her lips tightening into a thin line. Hang on, kid. The streets of Cedarvale blurred past them as Martha navigated the winding roads with practiced skill. The SUV closed the distance, its engine roaring as it accelerated. They're gaining on us, Lila cried. Not for long, Martha said. She took a sharp turn onto a side street, the tires squealing as the car narrowly avoided clipping the curb. The SUV followed, its headlights flashing in the rearview mirror. Lila gripped the seat, her knuckles white. What if they catch us? They won't, Martha said firmly. Trust me. She turned again, this time onto an even narrower street. The SUV hesitated for a moment, its driver unsure of the route, and Martha took the opportunity to gain some distance. Ahead, a police cruiser sat parked at an intersection, its lights flashing. The officers inside stepped out as the sedan approached, their hands raised to signal for the SUV to stop. They'll handle it from here, Martha said, her voice calm as she slowed the car and turned onto another street. The SUV skidded to a halt as the officers approached, their weapons drawn. The scene disappeared from view as Martha drove on, the tension in the car finally beginning to ease. Are we safe now? Lila asked, her voice trembling. For now, Martha replied. She reached over and gave Lila's hand a reassuring squeeze. But this is far from over. The sedan pulled into the Morgan house's driveway, and Martha cut the engine. The tension in the car was palpable, but she remained calm, her sharp eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. Hunter was already at the door, his ears perked as he watched them approach. The front door opened before they reached it, and Clara stepped out, her face etched with worry. Did anyone follow you? No, Martha replied briskly. But we had a close call. They know where she is. Clara. It's only a matter of time before they try again. Clara nodded grimly and stepped aside to let them in. The moment the door closed behind them, she turned to Hunter. We need you now more than ever. Boy. The dog's posture straightened as if he understood. His sharp amber eyes flicked between the two women before settling on Lila, who stood near the door clutching her bag. He moved to her side, pressing his body against her leg in a protective gesture. We're not staying here, Clara announced. her tone resolute. She crossed the room and pulled a small box from beneath the couch. Inside was a map and a series of envelopes marked with dates and numbers. She sorted through them quickly, her movements precise. "This is your father's plan," she explained, glancing at Martha. "He prepared for something like this. There's a network of safe houses he set up, complete with supplies and evidence caches. Hunter knows the way." Lila looked up sharply. "Hunter?" Clara nodded. "Your dad trained him for this. He'll lead you through the tunnels and get you to the first safe house. Martha will go with you." "And what about you?" Martha asked, her voice firm. "We're not leaving you behind." "Clara." "I'll slow you down," Clara replied. "If they're watching the house, they'll come for me first. That'll buy you time to get away." "That's not an option," Martha shot back. "We all go together. Or not at all." Before Clara could argue, Hunter let out a sharp bark, drawing their attention. He moved to the window, his body tense as he stared out into the darkened street. Clara followed his gaze and spotted a black SUV idling a few houses down. The faint glow of a cigarette in the driver's seat told her they weren't alone. "We don't have time to argue," Clara said. She grabbed the map and handed it to Martha. "Follow his lead. The tunnel entrance is behind the shed. I'll cover you." Hunter moved ahead as they slipped out the back door, his movements silent and deliberate. The yard was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. Martha held Lila's hand tightly, guiding her toward the shed while Clara remained on the porch, her shotgun cradled in her arms. As they reached the shed, Hunter nosed at a patch of dirt near the base of the structure. Martha knelt down and began clearing the debris, revealing a small hatch hidden beneath. She pulled it open, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading underground. "Go," Martha whispered to Lila, motioning for her to climb down. The girl hesitated for a moment before obeying, her feet disappearing into the shadows. Hunter followed close behind, his sleek frame moving effortlessly through the tight space. Clara watched from her position, her finger resting lightly on the shotgun's trigger. The SUV down the street hadn't moved, but she knew better than to assume they were safe. She waited until Martha disappeared into the tunnel before retreating into the house and locking the door behind her. The air in the tunnel was cool and damp, the faint smell of earth filling their noses as Lila and Martha descended. The space was narrow, the walls reinforced with wooden beams that creaked faintly under the weight of the soil above. It felt more like a forgotten cellar than an escape route. But the map in Martha's hand told a different story. "This tunnel connects to the first safe house," Martha explained, her voice low. "Your dad built these years ago. He said they were for emergencies. But I didn't realize how extensive they were." Lila glanced at Hunter, who led the way without hesitation. His ears flicked occasionally, his body language calm but alert. She reached down to touch his fur, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "How does he know where to go?" she asked. "Your dad trained him," Martha replied. "Hunter's not just a pet, Lila. He's a soldier. And right now, he's our best chance of getting out of this." They walked in silence for several minutes, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The tunnel twisted and turned, its path winding deeper into the earth. Hunter paused occasionally, sniffing the air before continuing, as if checking for unseen threats. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small chamber. A metal locker stood against one wall, its surface scratched and worn. Hunter stopped in front of it, sitting down and looking expectantly at Martha. "This must be one of the caches," she said, opening the locker. Inside were several supplies, bottled water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. There was also a sealed envelope with Ethan's handwriting on the front. Lila grabbed the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she opened it. The letter inside was short but direct, written in the same deliberate style as the one her grandmother had read earlier. If you've made it this far, you're on the right track. These tunnels are more than just escape routes. They're traps. Use them wisely, and you'll have the advantage. Trust Hunter. He knows the way. Ethan. Lila folded the letter carefully, her heart heavy as she tucked it back into the envelope. How did he plan all of this? She whispered. He always thought ahead, Martha said softly. He knew the risks of his work. He wanted to make sure you'd be safe, no matter what. Before they could continue, Hunter growled softly, his ears pinned forward. He moved to the edge of the chamber, his body tense. Martha froze, her hand tightening on the flashlight. What is it? Lila asked, her voice barely audible. Someone's coming, Martha said grimly. She turned off the flashlight, plunging the tunnel into darkness. Stay close to Hunter. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the tunnel, growing louder with each passing second. Martha motioned for Lila to move behind the locker, her heart pounding as the shadows in the tunnel grew darker. Hunter moved forward, his body low to the ground. He positioned himself between the approaching threat and his companions, his growl deep and steady. The sound was low enough to go unnoticed by the intruders but loud enough to reassure Martha and Lila that he was ready. The footsteps paused just outside the chamber, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness, scanning the space. Keep moving, a voice muttered. They're close. As the light swept past the locker, Hunter lunged, his attack silent and precise. The first man didn't have time to react before Hunter brought him down, his weight forcing the intruder to the ground with a muffled grunt. The second man turned, his weapon raised. But Martha stepped forward, slamming the butt of the flashlight into his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor, and Martha shoved him backward, her movements swift and controlled. Let's go, she hissed to Lila, grabbing her hand. Hunter released the first man and retreated, his body language signaling that it was time to move. They ran deeper into the tunnel, the sound of their pursuers fading behind them. Hunter led the way, his pace steady but urgent. Lila didn't look back, her trust in the dog absolute. The entrance to Safe House Alpha was nearly invisible, concealed by dense underbrush and the natural curvature of the forest floor. Hunter stopped first, his ears twitching and nose working overtime as he assessed their surroundings. Martha crouched behind him, her sharp eyes scanning the area, while Lila stayed close, clutching her flashlight tightly. This is it, Martha whispered, pointing to a camouflaged hatch embedded in the ground. She carefully brushed away the leaves and dirt covering it, revealing a steel door with a combination lock. Your dad didn't leave anything to chance. Lila swallowed hard, her heart pounding. What if someone found it already? They didn't, Martha said confidently. This place was designed to disappear. Let's get inside. She entered the combination Ethan had taught her years ago, and with a faint click, the hatch unlocked. The hinges creaked slightly as Martha pulled it open, revealing a short ladder descending into darkness. Hunter didn't hesitate. He moved down the ladder with practiced precision, his body graceful despite the confined space. Go, Martha said, motioning for Lila. I'll follow. The tunnel below was narrow but dry, with reinforced walls and a faint musty smell. Hunter waited at the bottom, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He moved forward as soon as Lila stepped off the ladder. His steps purposeful. "It's not far now," Martha reassured her, her voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. She closed the hatch above them, sealing them inside, before following Hunter deeper into the tunnel. After about 10 minutes, they reached a second door. This one was sturdier, with a keypad and a faint hum of electricity. Hunter sat beside it, his body still as a statue. Martha entered another code, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. "Safe House Alpha," she murmured as they stepped inside. The interior of the safe house was far more sophisticated than Lila had expected. It wasn't much bigger than a small apartment, but it was meticulously organized. There was a kitchenette in one corner, a desk with a computer in another, and a cot tucked against the far wall. Cabinets lined one side of the room, their doors labeled with precise handwriting. Hunter immediately began sniffing the perimeter, his movements methodical. Martha crossed to the desk, her eyes landing on a locked drawer. She fished a key out of her pocket, one Ethan had given her years ago, and unlocked it. Inside was a laptop, several USB drives, and a thick envelope. Martha placed everything on the desk, her expression tightening as she opened the envelope. It contained a stack of documents, each stamped with official seals. "What is it?" Lila asked, stepping closer. "Evidence," Martha replied. She held up a sheet of paper, her eyes scanning the text. "Bank statements, transaction logs. Your dad wasn't just after the cartel. He was after the people funding them." Lila's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Martha turned the paper so Lila could see it. "Look here. These are wire transfers, huge sums of money, coming from accounts tied to government officials. Your dad must have been tracking them for years." Lila's stomach churned as she stared at the paper. The numbers and names didn't mean much to her, but the implications were clear. So, the cartel had help? More than help, Martha said grimly. They had protection. These people were covering for them, giving them the resources they needed to operate. She plugged one of the USB drives into the laptop and opened a folder labeled Phase 1. The screen filled with documents, photos, and video files. Martha clicked on a video, and Lila leaned closer as the screen came to life. The footage was grainy but clear enough to recognize. It showed a group of men unloading crates from a truck, their faces partially obscured. One of the men was Victor Kane, his distinct build and commanding presence unmistakable. Your dad filmed this, Martha said, pointing to the timestamp. It's from 2 years ago. Right before he died. Lila's chest tightened. She couldn't look away from the screen, even as her eyes burned with unshed tears. Why didn't he show this to anyone? He couldn't, Martha said softly. If he'd gone public without enough evidence, they would have buried it in him. That's why he built these safe houses. He was laying a trap, gathering everything he needed to expose them all at once. As they continued reviewing the evidence, Hunter let out a low growl, drawing their attention. He stood near the door, his ears pinned forward and his body tense. What is it? Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Martha moved to his side, her hand resting on his back. He hears something. She turned off the laptop and motioned for Lila to stay quiet. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the faint sound of movement outside. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. They found us, Martha said grimly. She moved to one of the cabinets and opened it, revealing a small cache of weapons and tactical gear. She grabbed a handgun and handed another to Lila. I don't know how to use this, Lila protested. Just hold it, Martha instructed. It's better than nothing. Hunter growled again, his focus shifting to the door. Martha moved quickly, gathering the documents and USB drives and shoving them into a bag. We can't stay here. There's a secondary tunnel that leads out of here. We'll use it to escape. She slung the bag over her shoulder and motioned for Lila to follow her. Hunter took the lead, his growl fading as he moved into action. They exited through a hidden door at the back of the safe house, stepping into another narrow tunnel. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind them, growing louder with each passing second. Martha set a brisk pace, her flashlight casting long shadows on the tunnel walls. Keep moving, she urged, her voice low but firm. We're not out of this yet. The tunnel stretched before them like a jagged scar, its uneven walls and faint dampness adding to the sense of urgency. Hunter moved with precision, his body low, ears twitching to catch even the faintest sound. Lila followed closely behind him, her flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. Behind her, Martha maintained a steady pace, her weapon drawn and her movements deliberate. The further they moved from the safe house, the fainter the sounds of pursuit became. But they didn't dare slow down. Martha's sharp gaze darted between the tunnel ahead and the shadows behind them, her mind racing to interpret the faint echoes that seemed to chase them. Your dad built these tunnels for situations exactly like this, Martha said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension. He knew the cartel wouldn't stop once they got close. Lila glanced over her shoulder. But how did they find us? I thought this place was supposed to be hidden. They didn't know about the safe house, Martha explained. But they're trained, and they've been watching us. They probably tracked us to the general area and used drones or scouts to zero in. The thought sent a shiver down Lila's spine. She clutched the flashlight tighter, her heart pounding as Hunter paused ahead of them. His nose twitched, and he let out a soft growl, a low warning that made Martha freeze. What is it? Lila whispered. Martha held up a hand, signaling for silence. She moved forward slowly, her flashlight beam focused on Hunter. He stood motionless, his sharp eyes locked on a patch of ground ahead. It looked no different than the rest of the tunnel, but Hunter's body language told them otherwise. It's a tripwire, Martha muttered. Kneeling down, she examined the barely visible wire stretched across the tunnel, her lips tightening. Your dad wasn't just thinking about escape. He rigged these tunnels with traps. Traps? Lila echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha nodded, carefully disarming the tripwire with practiced hands. If someone follows us, they'll regret it. Once the wire was disabled, Hunter moved forward again, his steps deliberate as he led them deeper into the tunnel. The air grew cooler, and the walls began to curve, creating sharp turns that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Stay close, Martha instructed. These curves are meant to slow pursuers, but they could also trap us if we're not careful. They continued in silence, the weight of the evidence they carried pressing down on them. Lila's mind churned with thoughts of her father, of the meticulous planning that had gone into these tunnels and the safe house. She wondered how long he had worked on it, how many sleepless nights he must have endured to ensure their safety. Her thoughts were interrupted by Hunter's sudden stop. He turned his head slightly, his ears flicking as he listened. Martha raised her flashlight, scanning the area ahead. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, its walls reinforced with steel beams. A heavy metal door stood at the far end, its surface marked with scratches and dents. This is the junction, Martha said, her voice low. We can either continue to the next safe house or use the secondary escape route. What's the difference? Lila asked, her voice trembling slightly. The next safe house is more secure. But it's further away. Martha explained. The escape route is faster. But it puts us closer to the surface and closer to the cartel. Hunter moved toward the metal door, his nose brushing against the handle. He glanced back at Martha and Lila, his amber eyes steady and unyielding. He's saying we keep going, Martha said with a faint smile. Smart dog. She moved to the door and entered a code into the keypad beside it. The lock clicked, and the door swung open, revealing another tunnel. This one was narrower, its walls closer together and its ceiling lower. But it felt more secure somehow. They stepped inside, and the door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Martha turned to Lila, her expression serious. This is where things get harder. The cartel might not be far behind. And if they figure out how to disable the traps, they'll gain on us quickly. What do we do? Lila asked, her voice tinged with fear. We move fast. And we stay quiet, Martha said firmly. She placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, her grip reassuring. Trust Hunter. He knows the way. They pressed on, their pace quickening. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its dark walls closing in around them. Hunter led the way with unwavering focus, his movements fluid and precise. He paused occasionally to listen, his ears twitching at faint sounds that Lila couldn't hear. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel widened slightly, and Hunter stopped again. This time, he moved to a small alcove in the wall, nudging at a metal box embedded in the stone. Martha crouched beside him, her flashlight revealing another cache. Inside the box were more documents, another USB drive, and a handheld radio. Martha grabbed the items and stuffed them into her bag, her movements quick and efficient. This is part of the second phase, she said, showing Lila one of the documents. It was a blueprint of the tunnel system, marked with red XS at several points. Your dad mapped out every trap and junction. He wanted to make sure whoever followed us wouldn't make it far. Why didn't he tell us about this before? Lila asked. Because the less you knew, the safer you were, Martha replied. If the cartel had interrogated us, we wouldn't have been able to give them anything. As they prepared to move again, a distant sound reached their ears, a faint echo of voices and the clatter of boots on stone. Hunter growled softly, his body tensing. They're coming, Martha said, her voice grim. She pulled a small device from her bag and placed it on the ground. This is a motion sensor. If they get too close, it'll trigger an alert. What do we do now? Lila asked, her hands trembling. We keep moving, Martha said. She glanced at Hunter, who was already leading the way. And we trust him to get us out of here. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind them, growing louder as Hunter urged the group forward. His movements were quick but precise, his focus unyielding as he led them deeper into the tunnel. Lila's chest tightened with each step, her pulse pounding in her ears as the voices of their pursuers grew closer. How much further? Lila asked in a hushed whisper, her voice shaking. Not far, Martha replied, her tone calm but firm. She held the map tightly, her flashlight beam flickering as it bounced off the uneven walls. We're almost at the next junction. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing colder and heavier. The faint smell of damp earth filled their noses as they pressed on, the walls seeming to close in around them. Martha glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness behind them. They're gaining, she said grimly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device, placing it against the tunnel wall. It beeped faintly before she activated it. This should slow them down. What is that? Lila asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. Proximity mine, Martha explained, her voice steady. It's non-lethal, but it'll buy us time. They continued down the tunnel, the faint hum of the mine lingering in the air behind them. Hunter quickened his pace, his nose twitching as he navigated the twists and turns. His instincts were razor-sharp, guiding them through the labyrinthine network with unerring accuracy. The sound of an explosion suddenly roared behind them, shaking the tunnel walls and sending a cloud of dust and debris rushing toward them. Lila flinched, instinctively covering her head as the ground beneath her feet trembled. That was the mine, Martha said, her voice calm but urgent. It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down. They're still coming, though, aren't they? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Martha admitted. But we're not making it easy for them. They reached the next junction, a larger chamber with multiple tunnel entrances branching off in different directions. Hunter paused, his ears swiveling as he listened intently. He moved to the center of the chamber and sniffed the air, his body tense. Martha, Lila said, her voice tight with fear. Which way do we go? Martha examined the map, her eyes narrowing as she traced their route. This one, she said, pointing to the tunnel on the left. It leads to the next safe house. Hunter moved toward the indicated tunnel without hesitation, his body low to the ground as he pressed forward. Martha and Lila followed, their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the earth, the tunnel walls narrowing around them. The voices of their pursuers were faint but persistent, echoing faintly through the tunnels. Martha set a brisk pace, her flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Keep moving, she urged, her tone leaving no room for argument. We can't let them catch up. They reached another chamber, this one smaller and more secluded. A heavy steel door stood at the far end, its surface scratched and worn. Hunter approached it and sat down, his sharp eyes locked on the door as he waited for Martha to unlock it. Martha entered the code into the keypad beside the door, her movements swift and precise. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a faint hiss. They stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud. The new space was smaller than the previous safe house, more of a temporary refuge than a base of operations. A single metal table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by storage lockers and shelves. A faint hum of electricity filled the air, the room powered by a hidden generator. Martha moved to the table, pulling out the documents and USB drives they had collected. She spread them out, her expression focused as she examined the evidence. This is the second phase, she said, pointing to a set of encrypted files. Your dad planned to use this to expose the cartel's military tactics. How? Lila asked, her voice filled with both awe and confusion. By baiting them, Martha explained. He knew they'd come after you, and he knew they wouldn't be able to resist using their training and equipment. Every move they make in these tunnels is another piece of evidence against them. Hunter growled softly, drawing their attention. He stood near the door, his body tense as he stared at the tunnel beyond. Martha moved to his side, her hand resting on his back. They're here, she said quietly. The sound of footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint murmur of voices. Martha glanced at Lila, her expression hardening. Stay behind me. She grabbed a rifle from one of the lockers, her movements swift and practiced. She positioned herself near the door, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Hunter let out a low growl. His body coiled and ready to strike. Lila clutched the edge of the table, her heart pounding as the sounds outside grew louder. The footsteps paused. And for a moment, there was silence. Then, the door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. Hunter barked sharply, his growl deepening as the assault continued. "Martha," Lila said, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" "We fight," Martha replied, her tone firm. "And we trust your dad's plan." The door finally gave way, swinging open to reveal two men in tactical gear. They hesitated for a split second at the sight of Hunter. But that was all the time he needed. He lunged forward, his powerful jaws clamping onto the first man's arm and dragging him to the ground. Martha fired a warning shot, the deafening crack echoing through the small space. The second man ducked, raising his weapon. But Hunter was already on him, his movements swift and precise. "Move!" Martha barked at Lila, motioning toward the back of the room. "There's another exit, go!" Lila hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. But Hunter's sharp bark snapped her out of it. She grabbed the bag of evidence and ran toward the rear door, her heart pounding. Martha followed, firing another shot to cover their retreat. They burst into the tunnel beyond, Hunter leading the way once more. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. But they didn't look back. "We're not done yet," Martha said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "But we're getting closer." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The second safe house was buried deep beneath a sprawling, long-abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The once bustling factory grounds were now silent, with rusted metal scaffolding and broken windows standing as monuments to a forgotten era. It was the last place anyone would look for a secure bunker. And that was exactly why Ethan had chosen it. Hunter led the way, his movements sharp and purposeful as he navigated through the crumbling structure. Every so often, he would pause, his ears twitching as he listened for any sound that didn't belong. Martha and Lila followed close behind, their steps careful to avoid the debris scattered across the floor. "It's just ahead," Martha whispered, glancing at the map in her hand. She pointed to a rusted doorway partially concealed by a stack of disused machinery. "The entrance is behind there." They moved quickly, working together to shift the heavy debris aside. Beneath it, a reinforced steel door came into view, its surface scratched and worn but still secure. Martha punched in the access code, and the door slid open with a low hiss, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "Stay close," Martha instructed, leading the way down. The air grew cooler as they descended, the faint hum of a generator reaching their ears. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a bunker similar in design to the first safe house but larger and more fortified. Metal shelves lined the walls, stacked with sealed crates and equipment. A central workstation dominated the room, complete with multiple monitors and a secure server. Everything about the space spoke to Ethan's meticulous planning. "Start checking the shelves," Martha instructed, moving to the workstation. "There's bound to be more evidence here." Lila hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that gets people like Victor Kane locked away," Martha replied. She powered up the workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed the files stored on the server. "Your dad didn't just want to stop the cartel. He wanted to bring down everyone who enabled them." Hunter began sniffing the room, his nose leading him to a locked cabinet near the far wall. He pawed at it, letting out a low bark to draw Martha's attention. Good boy, she said. Crossing the room, she retrieved a key from her bag and unlocked the cabinet. Inside, she found several folders, a laptop, and an envelope labeled Phase 2. She opened the envelope carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. What is it? Lila asked, moving closer. Documents, Martha said, holding up a sheet of paper. Bank records, wire transfers, and emails. Look at this. She pointed to a series of transactions highlighted in red. These payments link directly to government officials. Bribes, kickbacks, you name it. Lila's stomach churned as she stared at the papers. They were working with the cartel? More than working with them, Martha replied. They were funding them. These officials funneled money into the cartel's operations in exchange for protection, influence, or a piece of the profits. This goes way beyond what I thought. She moved back to the workstation and plugged in the laptop, transferring the files to a secure drive. As she worked, Hunter let out another low growl, his body tense as he moved toward the door. They're coming, Martha said grimly, her fingers not stopping as she continued the transfer. We don't have much time. The safe house was designed to withstand a direct assault, with reinforced walls and a sophisticated security system. But Martha knew it wouldn't hold forever. She turned to Lila, her expression firm. Help me pack up what we can. Lila nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she began gathering the documents and USB drives. Each piece of evidence felt heavier than the last, the weight of its implications pressing down on her. She couldn't stop thinking about her father, how long he must have worked to uncover this, how much he must have sacrificed to keep them safe. This isn't just about the cartel, Lila said quietly, more to herself than to Martha. It's about everyone who let them get away with it. That's right, Martha replied without looking up. Your dad knew he couldn't stop them alone. That's why he left this for us, to finish what he started. She finished the transfer and disconnected the laptop, slipping it into her bag. Let's move. They're too close for comfort. As they prepared to leave, Hunter moved back to the door, his growl growing louder. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel beyond, followed by hushed voices. Martha grabbed a small device from one of the shelves, a motion-triggered alarm, and placed it near the door. This will give us a heads up if they try to breach, she said, her tone calm but urgent. She motioned for Lila to follow her to a secondary exit at the back of the bunker. The exit led to another tunnel, narrower and darker than the first. Hunter took the lead once again, his movements deliberate as he guided them through the twisting passage. The air grew colder, the walls damp with condensation. Every sound seemed amplified, the faint echo of their footsteps mixing with the distant voices of their pursuers. Keep moving, Martha urged, her voice low. We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible. The second safe house was now behind them, but the evidence they carried felt like a beacon drawing the cartel closer. Martha knew the importance of their mission, but she also knew the stakes. If they were caught, the cartel wouldn't just take the evidence, they'd eliminate anyone who posed a threat. As they reached a fork in the tunnel, Hunter paused, his nose working to detect any signs of danger. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching, before choosing the left path. Martha and Lila followed without hesitation, trusting the dog's instincts. They moved quickly, the weight of Ethan's plan driving them forward. Every step brought them closer to uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. But it also brought them closer to danger. Your dad's strategy was brilliant, Martha said as they walked. He didn't just gather evidence, he set traps. Every move the cartel makes, every piece of equipment they use, is being recorded. By the time this is over, they'll have exposed themselves. How did he think of all this? Lila asked, her voice filled with a mix of awe and sadness. He was always thinking ahead. Martha replied. He knew his work made him a target. So he planned for every possibility. He wasn't just protecting you, he was protecting the truth. The air in the tunnel grew colder as they moved further from the second safe house. Hunter led the way. His movements deliberate and precise. His nose twitching at every faint scent. Behind him, Martha held the map in one hand and her flashlight in the other. Her eyes darting between the narrow passage and the shadows behind them. Lila followed closely. Her bag of evidence clutched tightly to her chest. They're not far behind, Martha murmured, her tone calm but tense. She glanced over her shoulder. Her flashlight beam sweeping the tunnel. We need to stay sharp. Hunter paused at a junction, his ears twitching. He sniffed the ground, then turned sharply to the right. Without hesitation, Martha and Lila followed him, trusting his instincts. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls narrowing as the air grew heavier. How does he know where to go? Lila asked, her voice low but tinged with awe. Your dad trained him for this, Martha replied. Hunter isn't just leading us, he's reading the signs. The air currents, the smells, the faint vibrations in the ground. He knows when something's off. As if on cue, Hunter stopped abruptly, his body tense. He let out a low growl, his sharp eyes fixed on the path ahead. Martha immediately raised her flashlight, scanning the area. What is it? Lila whispered, her grip tightening on her bag. Martha crouched beside Hunter, her fingers brushing the dirt floor. She noticed a faint indentation, a tripwire, almost invisible in the dim light. It's a trap, she said quietly. They've set something up. She traced the wire to a small device embedded in the wall. It was crude but effective, a motion-triggered explosive designed to collapse the tunnel. Martha pulled a multi-tool from her pocket and began disarming it, her hands steady despite the stakes. Lila watched in silence, her heart pounding as Martha carefully cut the wire. With a faint click, the device powered down, and Martha exhaled. They're trying to box us in, Martha said, standing. But they didn't count on Hunter. The dog gave a soft bark, as if acknowledging her words, before continuing down the tunnel. The passage twisted and turned, the walls pressing closer as the group moved deeper underground. The faint sound of voices echoed behind them, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. Hunter quickened his pace, his movements smooth and purposeful. They're tracking us, Martha said, her tone grim. She stopped briefly to check the map, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. If they've got heat sensors or drones, they'll find us no matter where we go. Then what do we do? Lila asked, her voice trembling. We keep moving, Martha replied. Your dad's plan isn't just about running. It's about making them reveal themselves. Every step they take, every trap they set, it's all evidence. They reached another chamber, this one slightly larger than the previous junctions. A stack of crates sat against one wall, marked with Ethan's handwriting. Hunter moved to the crates, sniffing at the base before sitting down, his gaze fixed on Martha. This is another cache, Martha said, opening one of the crates. Inside were more documents, encrypted hard drives, and a portable satellite uplink. She pulled out the uplink, her brow furrowing. He planned for this. What is it? Lila asked. This lets us upload the evidence directly to a secure server, Martha explained. Your dad wanted to make sure nothing got lost. Even if we didn't make it out. She set up the uplink. Her fingers moving quickly as she connected it to the laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of encrypted files. Martha began the upload, her eyes scanning the progress bar. "It's going to take a few minutes," she said. "Keep an eye on the tunnel." Lila nodded, moving to stand beside Hunter. The dog was still, his body tense as he listened to the faint echoes of footsteps. Lila placed a hand on his back, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "Martha," Lila said quietly, her eyes wide. "What happens if they catch us?" "They won't," Martha replied without looking up. "And even if they do, they won't win. Your dad made sure of that." As the upload continued, the sound of voices grew louder. Hunter let out a low growl, his ears pinned back. Martha glanced at the progress bar, her jaw tightening. "Almost there," she muttered. "Just a little longer." The voices were clearer now, punctuated by the sharp clatter of boots on stone. The cartel was closing in, their movements echoing through the tunnels. Martha pulled out a small device, a proximity alarm, and set it near the entrance to the chamber. "If they get too close, we'll know," she said. Standing, "Be ready to move." The progress bar finally reached 100%, and Martha disconnected the uplink. She packed the laptop and hard drives into her bag, her movements quick and precise. "We're done here," she said. "Let's go." Hunter led the way out of the chamber, his sharp eyes scanning the path ahead. Martha and Lila followed, their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The tunnel narrowed again, the air growing colder as they pressed on. Behind them, the alarm went off, its shrill beep echoing through the passage. Martha glanced over her shoulder, her expression hardening. "They're here." The group quickened their pace, their breaths coming in short bursts as they navigated the twisting tunnels. Hunter paused occasionally, his ears flicking as he listened for signs of danger. Each time, he chose the safest path, his instincts guiding them through the maze. "They're too close," Martha said, her voice tight. "We need to lose them." Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Hunter stopped, sniffing the air before turning sharply to the right. Martha followed without hesitation, trusting his instincts. The new path was steeper, sloping downward into the depths of the earth. The walls grew damp, and the air was heavy with the smell of moss and decay. The sound of their pursuers faded slightly, but it was clear they hadn't given up. "They won't stop," Lila said, her voice trembling. "Will they?" "No," Martha replied. "Not until they get what they want. But they're making mistakes. They're getting desperate." She stopped briefly to set another proximity mine, her hands moving quickly. "This will slow them down." The group continued down the tunnel, Hunter leading the way. The dog's sharp focus never wavered, his movements fluid and precise. Behind them, the faint sound of an explosion echoed, followed by shouts of confusion. "That's our signal," Martha said. "Let's keep moving." The tunnel narrowed as Hunter led them deeper into the labyrinth. Every step was careful, deliberate, as though he was aware that one wrong move could mean disaster. Martha and Lila followed closely, their breaths shallow as they tried to stay as quiet as possible. The faint echoes of voices behind them grew fainter, but neither dared to believe they were safe. "Keep moving," Martha urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "The next junction isn't far." Hunter paused at a curve in the tunnel, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His ears flicked forward, and his posture stiffened. Martha immediately crouched beside him, scanning the path ahead with her flashlight. The beam landed on a faint shimmer stretched across the tunnel, a wire, nearly invisible in the dim light. "They've rigged another trap," Martha muttered, her tone grim. "This one's more sophisticated." "What do we do?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Hunter growled softly, his body tense but still. Martha studied the wire, following it to a small device partially embedded in the wall. She recognized the setup immediately, a pressure-triggered explosive meant to collapse the tunnel. "We disarm it," Martha said, pulling her multi-tool from her pocket. She handed her flashlight to Lila. "Hold this steady. I need to see exactly what I'm doing." Lila nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she held the beam steady. Martha worked quickly but meticulously, her fingers deftly cutting the wires and disabling the trigger. After a tense few moments, the device powered down with a faint click. "It's done," Martha said, standing. She placed a reassuring hand on Lila's shoulder. "You're doing great. Let's keep going." Hunter resumed the lead, his pace quickening as they navigated through a series of sharp turns. The air grew colder, the walls slick with condensation. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnel, masking the distant noises of their pursuers. As they reached the next junction, Hunter stopped abruptly, his nose to the ground. The tunnel forked into two paths, one sloping downward and the other curving sharply to the right. He sniffed both directions before choosing the right path, his movements confident and purposeful. "Martha," Lila said quietly, her voice hesitant. "How does he know where to go?" "Your dad trained him for this," Martha replied, her voice steady. "Hunter's not just following a scent, he's reading the environment. Air currents, vibrations, even the faintest traces of movement. He's a soldier, Lila. He knows how to keep us safe." They followed Hunter into the right-hand tunnel, the air growing heavier as the path sloped downward. The walls here were reinforced with steel beams, a clear sign that Ethan had modified this section of the tunnel. It felt safer, more secure. But Martha knew better than to let her guard down. At the end of the passage, they reached another chamber. This one was larger than the previous junctions, with several crates stacked neatly against the walls. A table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in maps and documents. A portable server hummed faintly in one corner, its blinking lights casting a faint glow. "This is it," Martha said, her tone filled with both relief and urgency. She moved to the table, her sharp eyes scanning the documents. "The next phase of your dad's plan." Lila approached the table cautiously, her gaze darting to the maps. "What do these mean?" Martha pointed to one of the maps, which showed a series of red XS marked along the tunnel network. "These are traps your dad set. If the cartel triggers them, it'll record their movements and equipment." He wasn't just gathering evidence, he was making them expose themselves. She picked up a folder, flipping through its contents. These documents show the connections between the cartel and their government allies. Financial records, encrypted emails, even photos. Your dad had everything he needed to bring them down. Then why didn't he? Lila asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Because he needed more," Martha replied. "If he'd gone public too soon, they would have buried it, or worse, come after you before he could stop them. He needed them to make a mistake, to reveal themselves." As Martha packed the documents and files into her bag, Hunter let out a sharp bark, his ears pinned forward. He moved to the tunnel entrance, his body tense and his growl low. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing second. "They're here," Martha said, her tone grim. She grabbed the portable server and stuffed it into her bag. "We need to move now." The group hurried into the next tunnel, Hunter leading the way. The path was narrower here, the walls pressing closer as the air grew colder. The faint hum of the server in Martha's bag was the only sound apart from their hurried footsteps. "They're getting desperate," Martha said, glancing over her shoulder. "They're making mistakes." "What do you mean?" Lila asked. "They're moving too fast," Martha explained. "They're not being careful. Every trap they set, every piece of equipment they use, it's all being recorded. Your dad's plan is working." Behind them, Victor Kane moved through the tunnels with his team, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. His frustration was palpable, his movements aggressive as he barked orders into his radio. "They're close," Victor growled. "Fan out. I want every exit covered." One of his men approached, holding a tablet displaying heat signatures. "They're heading toward the next junction. We can cut them off if we move now." "Do it," Victor ordered. "And no mistakes." The group pressed forward, their movements hurried but precise. Victor's jaw tightened as he studied the tunnel map on his tablet, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that they were being led into a trap. As they reached the next chamber, one of Victor's men paused, his flashlight illuminating a faint red light embedded in the wall. It blinked once, then twice, before going dark. "What was that?" the man asked, his voice uneasy. Victor's eyes narrowed. "A recording device," he muttered. "They're watching us." Realization dawned, his frustration boiling over as he slammed a fist against the wall. "They've been recording everything. Every move we've made. Every trap we've triggered, it's all evidence." The group continued moving through the tunnels, their pace quickening as the cartel closed in. Hunter led them with unwavering focus, his instincts sharp and his movements fluid. Martha and Lila followed, their determination unshaken despite the danger. As they approached the next safe house, the air grew colder, the walls narrowing around them. The faint sound of the cartel's footsteps echoed behind them. But Martha knew they were still one step ahead. "Your dad's plan is working," she said quietly, glancing at Lila. "We're almost there." The night air was colder now, biting through the thin fabric of Lila's jacket as she followed Hunter and Martha toward the final safe house. The terrain around them had shifted, the hard-packed dirt paths and industrial ruins of earlier safe houses gave way to overgrown grass, weathered fences, and the eerie silhouette of an abandoned farmhouse on the horizon. "Is this it?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible over the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Hunter paused near the farmhouse, sniffing the ground and scanning the area with sharp, deliberate movements. He didn't bark, but his tail was stiff, and his ears were pinned forward, signaling that they weren't alone. "This is it," Martha confirmed, her tone cautious. "But something feels off. Keep close. And stay quiet." The farmhouse was in a state of disrepair, its wooden frame sagging, windows broken, and the roof partially collapsed. It looked like the kind of place no one would bother to visit, perfectly unassuming. But as Hunter led them to the back of the structure, they found the reinforced steel door hidden beneath a pile of old boards and rusted tools. It was incongruous with its surroundings, an unmistakable remnant of Ethan's careful planning. Martha cleared the debris and punched in the access code. The door opened with a low hiss, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. "Let's move," Martha said, motioning for Lila to go first. "Hunter, watch our six." The dog obeyed, his steps silent as he lingered near the entrance, scanning for any movement before following them inside. The heavy door closed behind them, sealing them in a secure underground bunker. The final safe house was larger and more sophisticated than the others. The bunker's walls were reinforced with thick steel, and bright LED lights illuminated a space filled with tactical equipment, computers, and crates marked with military insignias. At the center of the room, a table was stacked with files, maps, and hard drives. "This is what your dad was building toward," Martha said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and urgency. She moved to the table, flipping through the files. "Everything we need is here." Lila approached the table cautiously, her eyes scanning the papers. She spotted a folder labeled Phase 3 and opened it. Inside were photos, reports, and encrypted communications between cartel leaders and high-ranking government officials. Her stomach turned as she realized the full extent of the conspiracy. "These people," she said, her voice trembling, "they were supposed to protect us." "They didn't care about protection," Martha replied sharply. "They cared about power, money, control, and they used the cartel to get it." Martha plugged a hard drive into the server and began transferring the files. As the data loaded, she explained the final piece of Ethan's plan. "This is the smoking gun," she said, pointing to a series of documents. "It connects the cartel to military contractors, politicians, and even law enforcement. Your dad wasn't just trying to stop the cartel, he was trying to dismantle the entire system that let them thrive." Hunter growled softly, drawing their attention. He stood near the door, his body tense as he sniffed the air. The faint sound of a vehicle engine reached their ears, growing louder by the second. "They're here," Martha said grimly. She grabbed her rifle and turned to Lila. "We need to finish this upload before they breach. Stay close to Hunter." Outside, Victor Kane surveyed the farmhouse from a distance, his expression dark and calculating. He held a tablet displaying thermal signatures, confirming that his targets were inside. "Surround the building," he ordered, his voice cold. "I want no escape routes. And prepare the charges. If we can't take the evidence, we'll bury it in them." His men moved swiftly, spreading out around the farmhouse and setting up breaching charges near the entrances. The glow of their equipment and the methodical precision of their movements made it clear they weren't just cartel enforcers, they were trained operatives, equipped with military-grade gear. Victor watched as one of his men approached. "They've already accessed the server," the man reported. "They're uploading the files." "Not for long," Victor said, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Shut it down." Inside the bunker, Martha worked quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she monitored the upload. The progress bar ticked upward, but it wasn't fast enough. "They're jamming the signal," she muttered, frustration clear in her tone. "Your dad planned for this, but it's going to take time to bypass their interference." "What do we do?" Lila asked, her voice tight with fear. "We buy time," Martha said firmly. She turned to Hunter, who stood ready at her side. "You know what to do, boy." Hunter responded with a sharp bark and moved toward the door, his body low to the ground. Martha handed Lila a small handheld device, a remote trigger for the countermeasures Ethan had installed. "If they breach, press this," she instructed. "It'll activate the perimeter defenses." "What about you?" Lila asked, her eyes wide. "I'll hold them off," Martha said. "And Hunter will make sure you're safe." The first breach came quickly. A deafening explosion rocked the bunker as the cartel detonated charges near the outer doors. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the lights flickered but held steady. Hunter growled. His sharp eyes locked on the door as it shuddered under the force of the blast. "Martha," Lila said, her voice trembling. "They're coming." "I know," Martha replied, her tone calm but urgent. She grabbed her rifle and moved to a defensive position near the entrance. "Stay back." The door buckled, and the first operative burst through, his weapon raised. Hunter launched himself at the man with terrifying precision, his powerful jaws clamping onto the attacker's arm and forcing him to the ground. The man's weapon clattered to the floor, and Hunter growled, keeping him pinned. Another operative followed, but Martha fired a warning shot, forcing him to take cover. "You're not getting through," she shouted, her voice echoing in the confined space. Meanwhile, the upload continued, inching closer to completion. Lila watched the progress bar anxiously, her hands gripping the remote trigger tightly. Every second felt like an eternity. "Come on. Come on," she whispered, her heart pounding. Hunter disabled another operative, his movements swift and tactical. He returned to Lila's side, his body coiled and ready to protect her. She placed a hand on his back, drawing strength from his steady presence. "You're amazing," she whispered. "We can do this." The sound of footsteps and shouting grew louder, but so did the hum of the server as the upload neared its completion. Martha fired another shot, forcing the attackers to retreat temporarily. "Almost there," she called to Lila. "Just a little longer." The tension in the bunker was suffocating as Martha crouched behind a metal barricade, her rifle trained on the entrance. Dust still hung in the air from the initial breach, illuminated by the dim, flickering lights overhead. The faint hum of the server was the only steady sound in the chaos, its progress bar inching closer to completion. "Keep your head down," Martha ordered, her voice steady despite the escalating danger. She could hear Victor Kane's men regrouping outside, barking orders to one another as they prepared for another assault. "This isn't over yet." Lila clutched the remote trigger tightly, her knuckles white. Her wide eyes darted between Hunter, who stood protectively in front of her, and the server, which was still uploading the evidence. "How much longer?" she asked, her voice trembling. 2 minutes," Martha replied, glancing at the screen. "We just need 2 more minutes." Outside, Victor Kane watched the scene unfold through his tablet, his sharp eyes narrowing at the glowing heat signatures inside the bunker. "They're stalling," he muttered, turning to one of his operatives. "Increase the signal jamming and prepare the charges. If we can't stop the upload, we'll make sure they don't leave here alive." The second wave came faster and harder than the first. The door to the bunker was blasted open, its reinforced frame groaning under the force of another explosion. The cartel operatives stormed in, their movements swift and calculated, weapons raised as they advanced in formation. Hunter launched into action, his powerful frame a blur of muscle and precision. He targeted the lead operative, knocking the man off his feet and sending his weapon skidding across the floor. The second operative hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Martha to fire a well-placed shot that forced him to retreat. "Hunter." "To me," Martha called, her voice cutting through the chaos. The dog obeyed instantly, his body coiling like a spring as he positioned himself between the attackers and Lila. His growl was low and menacing, a clear warning to anyone who dared come closer. The operatives regrouped, their leader barking orders as they prepared to advance again. "Keep the pressure on," he shouted. "They're pinned down. We'll take them out in the next push." As the firefight raged on, Martha activated one of Ethan's countermeasures, She hit a hidden switch beneath the table, and a series of automated defenses sprang to life. Small turrets emerged from the walls, their barrels swiveling to target the intruders. A burst of gunfire erupted, forcing the cartel operatives to dive for cover. "Your dad thought of everything," Martha muttered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She turned to Lila, who was crouched beside the server, her hands shaking as she watched the progress bar inch closer to completion. "Just hold on, kid. We're almost there." Hunter darted forward again, his sharp instincts guiding him as he tackled another operative. The man struggled against the dog's powerful grip, but Hunter was relentless, his training taking over as he disabled the threat. "Go, Hunter!" Lila shouted, her voice breaking through the tension. "You've got this." The dog's sharp ears twitched at her words, and he returned to her side, his amber eyes scanning the room for the next threat. He was calm and focused, every movement purposeful and precise. Outside, Victor Kane was growing increasingly frustrated. He watched the scene unfold on his tablet, his jaw clenched as he saw his men being outmaneuvered by a single dog and a handful of defenses. "They're playing us," he muttered, slamming his fist against the side of the vehicle. "We're wasting time." One of his operatives approached, holding a communications device. "Sir, the evidence is almost fully uploaded. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Victor's expression darkened. "Prepare the explosives," he ordered. "If we can't stop the upload, we'll bury them and destroy the data. No one leaves that bunker alive." The operative hesitated. "But sir, what if?" "Do it," Victor barked, his voice sharp and cutting. "We don't have time for second-guessing." Inside the bunker, the situation was becoming more dire. The server was at 95%, but the cartel operatives were closing in. The automated defenses had done their job, but the attackers were relentless, using smoke grenades and tactical maneuvers to push closer. "Martha, they're getting through," Lila cried, coughing as the thick smoke filled the room. She could barely see through the haze, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I know," Martha replied, her voice steady but urgent. She fired another shot, forcing an operative to take cover. "Just stay low and keep that trigger ready." As if on cue, Hunter let out a sharp bark, his body tense as he stared at the smoke-filled entrance. He darted forward, his powerful frame cutting through the haze as he took down another operative. His sharp teeth and relentless grip made quick work of the attacker, who cried out before collapsing to the ground. "You're incredible," Lila whispered, her voice filled with both awe and fear as she watched Hunter return to her side. The server finally reached 100%, and the screen flashed a message, "Upload complete. Files secured." "It's done," Martha shouted, her voice filled with relief. She grabbed the portable hard drive containing the data backup and stuffed it into her bag. "We've got what we need. Now we just have to get out of here." But as she spoke, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The lights flickered, and the sound of distant explosions echoed through the bunker. Victor Kane's scorched earth protocol had been activated. "They're trying to bring the whole place down," Martha said grimly. She turned to Lila, her expression firm. "We have to move now. Hunter, lead the way." Hunter didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward a hidden exit at the back of the bunker, his sharp instincts guiding him through the maze of tunnels. Martha and Lila followed closely, the sounds of collapsing walls and distant gunfire urging them forward. Outside, Victor Kane watched the explosions with grim satisfaction. The farmhouse was engulfed in flames, and the ground around it had caved in, burying the bunker beneath tons of rubble. "It's done," he said, his voice cold. "They won't be coming out of there." But even as he spoke, a faint movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the smoke and flames, moving swiftly and purposefully. It was Hunter. His sleek frame covered in dirt and ash, but his movements unrelenting. Behind him were Martha and Lila, coughing and bloodied but alive. Victor's eyes widened in disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered. "How?" Before he could finish, Hunter locked eyes with him, his growl low and menacing. The dog sprinted toward him, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The night was a blur of smoke, fire, and chaos as Hunter darted through the wreckage with unwavering determination. The once abandoned farmhouse was now a smoldering ruin. Its foundation collapsed under the weight of Victor Kane's scorched earth protocol. Flames licked at the edges of the rubble, casting flickering shadows that danced in the cold night air. Behind Hunter, Martha and Lila stumbled out of the bunker's emergency exit, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Lila clutched the bag containing the evidence tightly, her heart pounding as she tried to catch her breath. "We're clear," Martha said, her voice hoarse but steady. She glanced back at the collapsing structure, her mind racing. "But they're still out there." Hunter growled softly, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He was tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike at the first sign of danger. His instincts told him that Victor Kane wouldn't stop until the job was finished. "Come on," Martha urged, motioning for Lila to follow her. "We need to get to higher ground and regroup. Stay close to Hunter." At the edge of the property, Victor Kane watched the burning farmhouse with grim satisfaction. The glow of the fire reflected in his cold, calculating eyes as he spoke into his radio. "Status report," he barked. One of his operatives responded, his voice crackling through the static. "The primary structure is destroyed. No movement detected from the bunker." "Good," Victor replied. He turned to his second-in-command, a man whose face was obscured by a tactical mask. "Sweep the area. I want confirmation that they're dead." The masked operative hesitated. What if they made it out? The fire. "Do it," Victor snapped, cutting him off. "No one survives this." As his men fanned out across the property, Victor pulled up the thermal imaging display on his tablet. He frowned when he noticed a cluster of heat signatures moving away from the wreckage. His jaw tightened, and a wave of frustration washed over him. "They're still alive," he muttered under his breath. "Impossible." He slammed the tablet onto the hood of his vehicle and turned to his men. "Track them. Now. I don't care what it takes, find them and finish this." Hunter led the way through the dense woods surrounding the farmhouse, his movements silent and precise. The faint glow of the fire behind them lit their path, but it also served as a beacon, making it impossible to hide for long. "We need to keep moving," Martha said, her voice low. She glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "They'll be on us any minute." "What about the evidence?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "What if we lose it?" "We won't," Martha replied firmly. "Your dad's plan accounted for this. As long as we have Hunter, we have a chance." Hunter stopped abruptly, his ears twitching as he listened to the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. He growled softly, his sharp eyes locked on the darkness ahead. "They're close," Martha said, her grip tightening on her rifle. "Stay low and stay quiet." The group crouched behind a fallen log, their breaths shallow as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Hunter moved to the edge of the log, his body low to the ground, ready to pounce at a moment's notice. Through the trees, they saw the silhouettes of Victor's men, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the area. The cartel operatives moved in formation, their weapons at the ready. "They're sweeping the perimeter," Martha whispered. She glanced at Lila, her expression serious. "When I say go, you follow Hunter. He'll get you out of here." "What about you?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. "I'll buy you time," Martha replied. "Trust me." Before Lila could protest, Martha raised her rifle and fired a single shot, hitting a tree near the operatives. The loud crack echoed through the woods, drawing their attention. "There," one of the men shouted, pointing his flashlight in their direction. The group of operatives moved toward the sound, their weapons raised. Hunter barked sharply, signaling Lila to move. She hesitated for a moment before following him, her heart pounding as they darted through the trees. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, but she didn't look back. "Martha!" Lila cried, her voice breaking. "She'll be fine." Hunter's presence seemed to reassure her, even without words. The dog's unwavering focus and precision were a source of strength as they navigated the dark forest. Meanwhile, Martha held her ground, using the trees for cover as she fired at the operatives. Her shots were calculated, designed to keep them pinned down rather than eliminate them outright. She knew she couldn't hold them off forever, but she didn't need to. All she had to do was give Hunter and Lila enough time to escape. "You think you can stop us?" one of the operatives shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're outnumbered." Martha smirked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outsmarted." She triggered another of Ethan's countermeasures, a hidden flashbang device buried near her position. The bright burst of light and deafening sound disoriented the operatives, giving her a precious few seconds to reposition. As Lila and Hunter reached the edge of the woods, they found themselves at the base of a steep hill. Hunter paused, his sharp eyes scanning the area before motioning for Lila to follow him up the incline. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her breath ragged. Hunter didn't answer, but his body language was clear. He led her to a small clearing at the top of the hill, where the faint glow of headlights was visible in the distance. "Is that help?" Lila whispered, hope creeping into her voice. A moment later, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Detective Harper emerged from the tree line with a team of federal agents. He raised his hand in greeting, his face a mix of relief and determination. "Lila." "Hunter," Harper called out, jogging toward them. "Are you hurt?" "We're okay," Lila replied, tears streaming down her face. She held up the bag of evidence. "We have everything. My dad's plan, it worked." Before Harper could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the woods below. Victor Kane and his remaining men had emerged, their desperation driving them to make one final push. "Get her to safety," Harper shouted to one of his agents. He turned to Hunter, who stood at the edge of the clearing, his growl low and menacing. "You ready, boy?" Hunter barked sharply, his body coiled as he prepared to charge. Together, he and Harper led the agents into the fray, their movements synchronized and precise. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Victor Kane fought like a cornered animal, his desperation making him reckless. But it was clear that the tide had turned. The agents overwhelmed his men, systematically dismantling their formation. In the chaos, Hunter locked eyes with Victor. The cartel leader raised his weapon, but he hesitated, clearly unsettled by the dog's unwavering focus. "Not so tough now, are you?" Harper taunted, his weapon trained on Victor. Before Victor could respond, Hunter lunged, his powerful frame knocking the weapon from Victor's hands. The cartel leader fell to the ground, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief as the dog growled, keeping him pinned. "It's over," Harper said, stepping forward. "You lost." As the sun began to rise, the battlefield quieted. The agents secured the remaining cartel members, and the evidence was handed over for processing. Lila sat on a fallen log, her hands still clutching the bag as she watched Hunter receive praise from the agents. "You did it, boy," she whispered, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "You saved us." Martha emerged from the woods, her face smudged with dirt but her expression triumphant. She placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, her voice soft. "Your dad would be proud." The three of them stood together, watching as the agents loaded Victor Kane into a vehicle. The nightmare was over, but Ethan's legacy would live on through the evidence, through the justice they'd achieved, and through Hunter, the loyal protector who had never given up. The chaos of the operation had faded into a tense calm as federal agents secured the scene. The once smoldering farmhouse was now a ruin, its foundation barely visible under the weight of the collapsed rubble. The glow of emergency lights illuminated the faces of agents, who moved with purpose, cataloging the aftermath. At the center of it all stood Victor Kane, his wrists cuffed behind his back, his cold, calculating demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. "Victor Kane," an agent announced, reading from a prepared statement as the cameras rolled. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and aiding and abetting an international criminal organization. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victor didn't respond. His jaw was set, and his eyes burned with resentment as he was led to a waiting transport vehicle. His men followed behind him, their expressions grim. It was over. The operation he had meticulously constructed, the network of corruption he had helped maintain, had crumbled in a single night. Inside the temporary command post set up by the FBI, Detective Harper stood beside a monitor displaying the evidence that had been transmitted from the safe houses. Financial records, encrypted communications, and video footage scrolled across the screen, each piece more damning than the last. "This is enough to take them all down," Harper said, his voice heavy with a mix of relief and exhaustion. He turned to the lead federal agent. "You'll make sure this gets into the right hands?" The agent nodded. "Absolutely. This is bigger than any of us imagined. Your team did an incredible job." "It wasn't just us," Harper replied, his gaze shifting to Hunter, who sat nearby, his ears twitching as he watched the activity in the room. "That dog saved all our lives. He's the real hero." Hunter tilted his head at the sound of his name, his sharp eyes meeting Harper's. The detective crouched down, giving the dog a well-deserved pat on the head. "Good boy, Hunter. You did your part." As dawn broke over the ruins of the farmhouse, Martha and Lila stood on the outskirts of the scene, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and quiet relief. Lila clutched the bag containing the hard drive and remaining documents, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the night settled over her. "It's over, isn't it?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," Martha replied, her tone measured. She placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, her grip firm but comforting. "But your dad's work isn't done yet. The evidence we've gathered, it's just the beginning. There's still a long road ahead." Hunter approached, his presence steady and reassuring. He nudged Lila's hand with his nose, his warm amber eyes filled with understanding. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck as tears slipped down her cheeks. "We couldn't have done it without you," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You're amazing, Hunter." The dog let out a soft whine, leaning into her embrace. He didn't need words to convey his loyalty and love. Later that day, the FBI held a press conference to announce the arrests and reveal the scope of the operation. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as the lead agent stepped up to the podium. "Last night, a major international conspiracy was brought to light," the agent began, his voice steady and clear. "Thanks to the bravery and determination of a small team, we were able to gather evidence that connects an international cartel to corrupt officials, military contractors, and a network of illegal operations spanning multiple countries. This evidence will serve as the foundation for one of the largest criminal investigations in recent history." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We would like to honor the late Ethan Morgan, whose foresight and sacrifice made this operation possible. His meticulous planning and unwavering commitment to justice have left a legacy that will not be forgotten." The agent motioned to Martha, Lila, and Hunter, who stood to the side of the stage. "We would also like to recognize Martha Morgan and her granddaughter, Lila, who risked everything to complete Ethan's mission. And, of course, Hunter, whose courage and training were instrumental in bringing the perpetrators to justice." The room erupted in applause as Martha and Lila stepped forward, their expressions a mix of pride and humility. Hunter stood at their side, his ears perked as the cameras captured his every move. As the press conference concluded, an agent approached Lila with a small, sealed envelope. Her breath caught as she recognized her father's handwriting on the front. The words for Lila were written in bold, steady strokes. "He left this for you," the agent said softly. "We found it with his personal effects." Lila stared at the envelope, her hands trembling as she took it. She could feel the weight of her father's presence in the small, unassuming package, and her chest tightened with a mix of longing and sadness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That evening, Martha and Lila sat together on the edge of a quiet hill overlooking the wreckage of the farmhouse. The chaos of the day had subsided, leaving only the faint hum of generators and the occasional murmur of agents wrapping up their work. Lila held the envelope in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges as she debated whether to open it. Hunter sat beside her, his body warm and solid against her side. "Are you ready?" Martha asked gently. Lila nodded, her throat tight as she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Lila," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've faced more than I ever wanted you to. It means you've been stronger than I ever imagined. And it means you've made me prouder than words can say." Lila's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. The letter spoke of her father's love for her, his regrets for leaving her to face the world without him, and his hopes for her future. He wrote about the importance of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond of family. "You are my legacy, Lila," the letter concluded. "And I know you'll carry it with the same strength and determination that brought you through this. Never forget that you are loved. And never forget how proud I am of you." Lila clutched the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely now. Martha wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close as they sat in silence, the weight of Ethan's words settling over them like a warm embrace. Hunter let out a soft whine, his head resting on Lila's lap. She smiled through her tears, running a hand through his fur. "We'll be okay," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "We'll be okay." The rolling hills of Montana stretched endlessly before them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It had been 2 months since Martha and Lila left the chaos of the operation behind, retreating to the quiet sanctuary of a secluded valley. The move had been a deliberate choice, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to honor Ethan's memory in a place untouched by the violence they had endured. Their new home was a modest cabin nestled at the base of a hill, surrounded by fields of wildflowers and tall pines. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the rustle of the wind and the distant call of birds. It was a stark contrast to the high-stakes world they had escaped, and that was exactly what they needed. Hunter had taken to the new environment with ease. He spent his days exploring the open fields, his nose to the ground as he followed the scents of rabbits and deer. Despite the tranquil setting, his protective instincts hadn't dulled. He patrolled the property with the same precision and discipline he had shown during the operation, his sharp eyes always scanning for potential threats. "Still on duty, aren't you, boy?" Martha said one morning, watching as Hunter completed his usual circuit around the cabin. She smiled as he trotted back to her, his tail wagging slightly. "You've earned a break, you know." But Hunter didn't seem interested in slowing down. Even in this peaceful corner of the world, he remained ever vigilant. Inside the cabin, Lila was unpacking the last of the boxes. She had insisted on bringing everything that had belonged to her father, unable to leave behind the pieces of him that still felt so present. Among the items were old photos, notebooks filled with his meticulous handwriting, and a box of keepsakes he had collected over the years. "Need any help?" Martha asked, stepping inside and brushing dirt off her hands. "I've got it," Lila replied, though her voice was tinged with exhaustion. She pulled out a small wooden box from the larger crate, her fingers tracing the carved edges. "This was his, wasn't it?" Martha nodded, recognizing the box immediately. "He used to keep all his important things in there. Letters, mementos, things that mattered to him." Lila opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of items that seemed unremarkable at first glance: an old pocket knife, a faded photograph of their family, a medal from Ethan's time in the military, and a folded piece of paper. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked up the photograph, her father's familiar smile staring back at her. "He carried this with him," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Even when he was gone, he kept us close." Martha placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He never stopped thinking about you, Lila. Everything he did was for you." Life in the valley settled into a steady rhythm, one that felt almost foreign after the chaos of the past months. Martha took on the role of teacher and mentor, sharing the skills she had learned during her years in the military. She taught Lila how to start a fire, purify water, and navigate using the stars, practical lessons that also served as a way to reconnect with her granddaughter. "You're a quick learner," Martha said one evening as they sat around a small fire outside the cabin. The flames crackled softly, casting warm light on their faces. "Your dad would have been proud." "Do you really think so?" Lila asked, her gaze fixed on the fire. "I know so," Martha replied firmly. "He always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. That's why he left you Hunter. He knew you were stronger than you realized." Hunter lay nearby, his head resting on his paws as he listened to their conversation. His presence was a constant source of comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, they weren't alone. One afternoon, while exploring the property, Lila stumbled upon a small, overgrown garden behind the cabin. The rows of faded markers suggested it had once been a vegetable patch, but it had long since fallen into disrepair. She knelt in the dirt, brushing aside the weeds to reveal the remnants of what had once been thriving plants. "Think we could bring it back to life?" she asked Martha later that day. "It's worth a try," Martha replied with a smile. "Your dad used to say that gardening was good for the soul. Maybe it's time we gave it a shot." Together, they began the process of clearing the garden, pulling weeds and turning the soil. It was hard work, but it was also therapeutic, a chance to focus on something tangible, something that grew and flourished under their care. Hunter joined them. His curiosity piqued as he sniffed at the freshly turned earth. He watched intently as Lila planted seeds, his tail wagging slightly whenever she looked his way. "Think he knows what we're doing?" Lila asked, laughing. "Oh, I'm sure he does," Martha replied. "Hunter's smarter than most people I know." As the weeks turned into months, the valley began to feel like home. The garden flourished. The cabin was filled with the warmth of laughter and conversation, and the wounds left by the operation slowly began to heal. Lila found herself thinking about her father less with pain and more with pride. Her memories of him a source of strength rather than sorrow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila sat on the porch with Hunter by her side. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the kind of beauty that took her breath away. "Do you think he'd like it here?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Martha stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Lila and took a seat beside her. "I think he'd love it," she said, her voice soft. "This is the kind of place he dreamed of for you. A place where you could just be." Lila nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's peaceful." "It is," Martha agreed. She glanced down at Hunter, who had settled into a relaxed position at their feet. "And with Hunter here, we've got the best protector anyone could ask for." The dog looked up at the sound of his name, his eyes filled with a quiet intelligence that seemed to understand everything they said. He let out a soft huff, as if to acknowledge their words, before resting his head on his paws. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Lila asked, her voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Martha placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. "We are," she said, "because we've got each other. And that's all we need." The evening air was cool and still as Lila sat on the porch of their cabin, the wooden planks beneath her rocking gently with the rhythm of her chair. The stars above Montana's valley twinkled against the vast, dark sky, and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. Hunter lay at her feet, his warm presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. Beside her, on the small table, sat Ethan's final letter, its edges worn from where her fingers had traced it over the past few weeks. She hadn't yet had the strength to open the second envelope, a smaller one tucked inside the letter, marked with the simple phrase, "For your future." Martha had told her to take her time, but tonight felt different. Something about the peacefulness of the moment felt like an invitation to step forward, even if the weight of the past still lingered. "Ready, girl?" Martha asked as she joined Lila on the porch, carrying 2 cups of tea. Her voice was gentle, not pushing, but understanding the significance of the moment. "I think so," Lila said, her voice soft. She picked up the envelope, turning it over in her hands before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was another handwritten note, smaller this time, and a folded sheet of paper that looked like a map. She unfolded the note first. It was written in the same neat, confident handwriting that had come to feel like a lifeline, a tether to her father's wisdom and love. "Lila," the note began, "if you're reading this, it means you've made it through the hardest part. I always knew you would. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. And you've shown more courage than most people do in a lifetime. I left this for you because I wanted you to have something to look forward to, a gift. In a way. For the incredible person you've become. This map is a piece of something special. It's where I hoped we could go one day, a place I found during one of my missions. Untouched by the chaos of the world. I never got the chance to take you there. But I want you to go. And I want you to remember that no matter where you are, I'm always with you. Love, Dad. Tears blurred Lila's vision as she finished reading. She carefully unfolded the map, her hands trembling as she traced the faint lines and markings. It was of a remote area, not far from where they were now, with a small X drawn in red ink at the base of a mountain range. Beside it, her father had written a single word, sanctuary. What does it say? Martha asked gently, her gaze soft as she watched Lila process the letter. He wanted me to go there, Lila said, holding up the map. It's somewhere he thought was special. He called it Sanctuary. Martha leaned in to study the map, her expression thoughtful. Looks like it's not far from here. We could make the trip in a couple of days. Hunter let out a soft bark, his tail thumping against the porch as if in agreement. Lila smiled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. What do you think, boy? Up for an adventure? The dog's response was immediate, a low, playful growl that made both Lila and Martha laugh. Sounds like a yes to me, Martha said, her smile warm. Let's plan for it. The next morning, they packed light, bringing only the essentials. Hunter seemed to sense the significance of the journey, his usual energy tempered by a calm focus as he stuck close to Lila's side. They followed the map's directions, winding through narrow trails and open meadows, the landscape gradually giving way to rugged hills and dense forest. By midday, they reached the base of the mountain range marked on the map. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Hunter paused, his ears twitching as he listened to the sounds of the forest. He looked back at Lila, his amber eyes bright and alert. This is it, Martha said, checking the map. She pointed to a small clearing up ahead. The spot he marked should be just beyond that ridge. They continued on foot, the terrain growing steeper but manageable. Hunter led the way, his nose to the ground as he followed an invisible trail. When they finally crested the ridge, the view that greeted them took their breath away. The clearing was nestled in a natural valley, surrounded by towering trees and jagged peaks. A crystal-clear stream wound its way through the grass, reflecting the sunlight and shimmering waves. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, their vibrant colors standing out against the deep greens and browns of the forest. This is beautiful, Lila whispered, her voice filled with wonder. It's perfect, Martha agreed, her tone soft. Your dad had good taste. Lila walked to the center of the clearing, her eyes taking in every detail. She could almost feel her father's presence here, as though he had left a piece of himself in the air, the water, and the earth. It was a place that felt untouched by time, a sanctuary, just as he had described. As the sun began to set, they set up a small camp by the stream. Lila sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, her legs crossed and her gaze distant as she thought about her father. Hunter lay beside her, his head resting on her lap. You were right, she said softly, her voice directed at the sky. This is exactly what we needed. Martha joined her, sitting on the grass with a small smile. You think he knew we'd find peace here? I think he hoped we would, Lila replied. She glanced down at Hunter, her hand resting on his back. And he was right. We're going to be okay. They stayed there for hours, watching the stars emerge one by one in the night sky. It was a moment of quiet reflection. A chance to let go of the pain and embrace the healing that had begun. Before they left the next morning, Lila placed a small keepsake, a photo of her and her father, at the base of a tree near the stream. It felt like a way of leaving a part of him there, in the sanctuary he had dreamed of sharing with her. "We'll come back," she promised, her voice steady. "This isn't goodbye." Hunter barked softly, as though agreeing, and they began the journey home. The return to their cabin was quiet, but it carried a newfound sense of peace. Lila felt lighter, as though the weight of her father's absence had been replaced with the strength of his love and the legacy he had left behind. Hunter seemed to feel it too, his steps more relaxed, his demeanor calm. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lila opened her father's letter once more. She read his words aloud, her voice steady as she let their meaning sink in. "You are my legacy," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames. "And I won't let you down." Martha placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression filled with quiet pride. "He'd be so proud of you, Lila." "I know I am." Hunter let out a soft sigh, curling up beside Lila as the fire crackled. The cabin was warm, the valley outside peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were truly home. Hunter lies by Lila's side, ever watchful, even in peace. Some heroes don't wear capes, they walk on four legs. What do you think defines true loyalty? Share your thoughts in this story with others. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.